Today's subject, if we can even call him human, is a true monster who long ago lost any trace of humanity. His crimes were so horrific and carefully planned that it took investigators years to finally catch him. At night, on the outskirts of the city, ladies of the night looked for clients along the roads. These were the women most often chosen as victims. The killer became a monster who spread fear across Novosibirsk. Novosibirsk is Russia's third-largest city, after Moscow and St. Petersburg. Home to more than 1.5 million people, it sits at the heart of Siberia, known for its harsh climate, long winters, and the icy Ob River that cuts the city in two. Most of the victims' remains were later discovered on the outskirts of Novosibirsk, hidden in tree lines, on empty lots, or dumped along the side of roads. Many bodies were found decapitated or dismembered. In some cases, internal organs were missing. Sometimes the corpses were stuffed into trash piles or old pieces of furniture, as if the killer was deliberately mocking the investigators. On the skin of some victims, pentagrams had been carved. Amulets were left beside the bodies, and in certain cases, the victims' heads were placed inside hoods, staging the scene to look like ritual killings. The investigation would later reveal that the killer was driven by an attraction to murder and sadism. But in order to actually commit his crimes, he needed a trigger, something we'll learn about later. One man was behind all of these horrific crimes, a man no one would have ever imagined capable of such things. Yevgeny Alexandrovich Chuplinsky was born on March 14, 1965 in Novosibirsk. Little is known about his parents, but it's said his family lived modestly and without major social problems. In school, he was just an average student. He kept to himself, tried to do well, and never showed aggression or criminal behavior. In the biographies of many serial killers, investigators often find signs of trauma in childhood: abusive parents, violence, or constant conflict. But in Chuplinsky's case, there was nothing like that. By all accounts, he grew up a normal child, without any obvious warning signs. Those who remembered Chuplinsky from his army days and later in the police often said he was always eager to please his superiors. During his service in the border troops from 1984 to 1987, fellow soldiers noticed how much effort he put into keeping his officers happy. He was diligent and eager to maintain the image of a proper Soviet young man, earning multiple commendations. After his service in the border troops, Chuplinsky joined the police. He started out as a simple patrol officer in Novosibirsk and later worked in the Leninsky district department. Colleagues called him Chupa Chups, a nickname for a man who was always sucking up to his bosses. On paper, he looked like a model officer. Dozens of letters of commendation, even a medal for excellence in service. But behind this mask of a perfect policeman was the man who would become one of Siberia's most notorious serial killers. While serving in the Leninsky district police, Chuplinsky was involved in what locals called the protection of sex workers. Together with other officers, he would patrol their spots, not to stop the trade, but to collect money in exchange for protection. Prostitutes paid to be left alone, to avoid arrest. This made them vulnerable. The police knew their faces, knew where they worked, and could easily exploit their position, and Chuplinsky knew it all. He knew the women by name. He knew which corners they worked, when they appeared, and when they were most vulnerable. More importantly, he knew the system itself, when patrols were scheduled, when reports were due, and when nobody would be watching. It allowed him to choose the perfect time to strike. On November 19, 1998, he struck for the first time. In a garbage dump just beyond the city limits, investigators found a headless torso. Nearby lay the severed head. The victim was never identified. Without a name or leads, the case went nowhere. At the time, police treated it as a one-off killing. But it was only the beginning. Chuplinsky had learned he could kill and get away with it. Then came the second killing. In February 1999, part of the same victim's body was found, 2 severed feet discovered on a wasteland. and later, in April, the torso and head were located in another location just beyond the city. Crucially, this victim was identified via fingerprint records. Her humanitarian trace continued beyond her disappearance. That fact shifted the investigation. One murder without a name had been dismissed. Now the second had a face. But Chuplinsky didn't just stop at 2 murders. As time went on, investigators would uncover a staggering total of 19 victims, and some even suspect that the real count could be even higher. What made many of these crimes particularly chilling was their almost ritualistic presentation. On the bodies of certain victims, investigators discovered pentagrams carved right into the skin. Next to some corpses, there were amulets, odd trinkets and charms meticulously arranged as if they were part of a dark ceremony. In the most horrifying instances, severed heads were tucked away inside hoods, creating the unsettling illusion of occult executions. For years, this led investigators astray. Was Novosibirsk truly under the grip of a satanic cult? Local whispers spread like wildfire, fueling panic. Some spoke of black masses taking place in the Siberian woods. Others believed an underground sect was sacrificing women. Yet the reality was far more sinister and straightforward. The impact was devastating. It made people feel as though they were facing something supernatural, something beyond comprehension. And all the while, Chuplinsky continued his hunt. He didn't kill without a reason. He needed a trigger, most often an insult from a woman or a remark about a venereal disease. That's when he would snap and move on to murder. He later described the feeling as, "Her life was leaving her and flowing into me." This reveals the sadistic, almost ritualistic nature of his actions. He constantly refined his methods of killing and disposing of bodies, showing cold-blooded calculation and precision. During the investigation, he underwent a psychological and psychiatric evaluation. The conclusion: homicidomania, a pathological urge to kill. He had a sadistic craving for control, humiliation, and violence. At the same time, he was found to be fully sane. He understood his actions and was capable of controlling them. The protection scheme had become too obvious, and his superiors could no longer ignore it. Chuplinsky was given a choice: resign or accept a transfer. He was reassigned to the Leninsky District Department, officially explained as closer to home, but in reality it was a discreet way to move a compromised officer out of sight. On paper, everything looked respectable. Chuplinsky continued his service, received commendations, and maintained the image of a model policeman. In truth, however, he was sinking deeper into his double life. By day, a uniformed officer. By night, a predator hunting the very women he once claimed to protect. By the year 2000, it had become clear that a serial killer was operating in Novosibirsk. The local homicide unit created a permanent task force to study the crimes, but the cases were still filed under different district prosecutors and often suspended. The real reason was darker. No one in the regional leadership wanted to admit that a serial killer was operating on their watch. It was easier to stall investigations, to bury them in paperwork, than to publicly face the truth. And while bureaucracy paralyzed the system, Chuplinsky kept hunting. It wasn't until 2005 that prosecutors finally decided to gather all the cases under a single investigator. He was assigned to review every missing person report involving women who had worked in prostitution. On his desk landed 16 case files with human remains, along with dozens of reports of missing women. The first analysis suggested that all of the crimes were likely committed by the same person, or possibly a small group, who had been operating for years, refining their methods with each attack. Additional forensic tests were ordered and witnesses were questioned again. But in 2006, the investigation was suspended once more, officially due to the lack of a concrete suspect. Only after the creation of the investigative committee in 2007 was the case reopened, and this time, it never stopped. Within a few months, investigators compiled a list of 18 possible suspects. Among them was Yevgeny Chuplinsky. But at that stage, there was no hard evidence linking him to the murders. Investigators first noticed Chuplinsky not because of a body, but because of a missing woman. Her remains were never found, but her phone was. In the summer of 2004, the woman's mother reported her missing. When police checked the records, they saw something suspicious. That very night, her phone had been activated with a new SIM card, registered to Yevgeny Chuplinsky. When questioned, he calmly explained that he was doing side work as a cab driver and 2 passengers had supposedly left the phone in his car. As a former police officer, his story sounded believable, and investigators let it go. But when it came time to give an official statement, his version changed. Now he claimed the same men had tried to rob him. A fight broke out, he said, and in the chaos, they dropped the phone. He picked it up, but insisted he was ready to hand it over to the authorities. At the time, no one pushed further. But this strange story left a mark, and investigators quietly noted his name. Later, it would resurface, and this time he wouldn't slip away so easily. 2 years later, in 2006, when investigators finally pulled together all the unsolved cases, troubling coincidences began to surface. Yevgeny Chuplinsky had always claimed he didn't know one of the missing women. By then, however, investigators had proof she was a sex worker, and that she was acquainted with him. When they began talking to his former colleagues, a darker picture emerged. Rumors circulated that Chuplinsky had been protecting the very women who worked the so-called Drunken Road, the strip where many prostitutes had disappeared. The deeper they dug, the more inconsistencies piled up in his statements. Authorities decided it was time to act. Chuplinsky was taken into custody, this time as a suspect in the killings. For 3 months, he sat behind bars while investigators combed through his life. Formally, his record looked clean, but his past raised questions. In 2000, the head of the security division where Chuplinsky worked had confronted him with a choice: resign or transfer. The reason? Persistent rumors that he was extorting prostitutes, collecting 50 rubles a day from each woman under his protection. Witnesses confirmed the same. Many women told investigators that after they were questioned by the investigative committee, Chuplinsky would press them for details, what questions had been asked, and whether his name had come up. He later explained this away as fear of being exposed for corruption. But to investigators, the excuse seemed oddly convenient, especially for a retired officer. Then came a dramatic moment: a search of one of his garages with the help of a cadaver dog. The animal walked in, lay down on the floor, and refused to move. To the detectives, it looked like bodies were buried beneath the concrete. They tore up the floor, but found nothing. Later, a dog handler explained, such a reaction can also be triggered by traces of old human blood. At the time, though, investigators dismissed it. After 3 months with no solid evidence, Chuplinsky was released, with apologies. But suspicion never went away. Investigators privately remained convinced he was behind the disappearances. For years, the case stalled. Victims' remains were too decomposed to identify weapon marks, and many women were never identified at all. Without names, there were no connections, no witnesses to retrace their last days. The turning point came a decade later in 2016, when a modern DNA laboratory finally opened in Novosibirsk. Lead investigator Igor Shishayev ordered fresh forensic tests on every scrap of evidence. And suddenly, cases began to light up. Biological traces, skin under the victim's fingernails, semen on clothing, even fragments preserved from crime scenes were matched to one man, Yevgeny Chuplinsky. In April 2016, 18 years after his first known murder, he was arrested again. This time, the evidence was overwhelming. At his very first interrogation, Chuplinsky slipped up, revealing details he shouldn't have known. He quickly realized his mistake and tried to backpedal. He insisted his contact with sex workers had always been official business, gathering intelligence for reports, nothing more. He explained away his collection of knives as an innocent hobby, even though he admitted an obsession with blades. But investigators were patient. They gave him only the minimum information required by law, forcing him to talk. Time and again, Chuplinsky revealed details only the killer could have known. The DNA results crushed his defense. Realizing what he was facing, Chuplinsky and his lawyer made a calculated move. In June 2016, they agreed to a pre-trial cooperation deal. Under Russian law, this could reduce his sentence to no more than 2/3 of the maximum if he fully disclosed every crime he had committed. For investigators, this was a breakthrough. Chuplinsky began talking and revealed far more murders than police had even suspected. According to his own accounts, it always began the same way. He cruised the drunken road in his car and picked up a woman. They would drive off, often drinking alcohol he'd brought along. Then came the trigger, an insult, a mention of disease or anything that pricked his pride. That's when he turned violent. His first killing, he admitted, had been messy and chaotic. But after that, he perfected a method. From behind, he would lock his arm around the victim's throat, lift her off the ground, and wait. He described it in chilling detail. When her legs started to twitch and then went still, I knew she was gone. It felt like her life was leaving her and flowing into me. Later, he would mutilate bodies, sometimes carving them, sometimes using scissors to cut soft tissue from skulls to delay identification. Each killing was more precise, more calculated than the last. Yet even after agreeing to the deal, Chuplinsky never fully admitted guilt. He painted himself as a victim, claiming the women provoked him or that he was carrying out punishment. At one point, he tried shifting blame to a former colleague who had conveniently died years earlier. Investigators were ready. Every session was filmed. Experts later confirmed there was no coercion, no planted words. Chuplinsky was telling the truth, though never the whole truth. Fearing that incomplete confessions might void his deal, Chuplinsky and his lawyer eventually withdrew from the agreement. He now denied everything, claiming he'd been forced into confessions. In the end, he demanded a jury trial, believing he could sway ordinary citizens more easily than a professional judge. The gamble failed. On March 6, 2018, after weeks of testimony, the Novosibirsk Regional Court delivered its verdict. The jury had unanimously found him guilty and undeserving of mercy. Chuplinsky was convicted of murdering and dismembering 19 women between 1998 and 2004. 12 of them remain unidentified to this day. Local media dubbed him the Novosibirsk Ripper. On September 15, 2019, he was transferred to IK6 Snezhinka, a special regime penal colony, where he remains to this day. The story of Chuplinsky is one that stays with you. It carves itself into memory and chills you to the bone. The most terrifying part is that none of us can ever know for sure. Someone just like him could be living nearby. Once a day, I catch myself thinking, what if, in this crowd, or that man sitting at a cafe table, is dangerous? The story of Chuplinsky reminds us, evil often wears an ordinary face, and that is what makes it truly terrifying. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe. You're not liking the terrible case itself, but my work, the research, the fact gathering, and the way the story was put together. Thank you.